Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon. I'm the Dean of Graduate Research at Flinders University, and welcome to Vlog 58, From a Blog to a Book. And this vlog comes via request from Rachel. A big hello to Rachel. And as you may know, it's linked with the previous week's vlog that investigated the blog for a PhD student. But this one has a much more specialist function. We're going to investigate today how something as basic as a blog that you have control over can enable and support and provide the foundation for a scholarly monograph. So Rachel, this was a terrific suggestion, and I will deliver that suggestion to you today. But as you can see, I'm joined by a rather familiar presence in these vlogs. And needless to say, Professor Steve Redhead, Professor of Cultural Studies at Flinders University, is back via request. Andrew's grandchildren actually produced a video for me requesting that he returns. And Sarah, a big hello to Sarah, said that her favourite vlogs were actually the ones I did with Steve. So I'll try not to take that personally, but there is a reason why he is returning to this vlog, because after Rachel's request, Steve has just done what Rachel wants to talk about. He has just constructed a blog, and it has become a book that he is delivering to publishers this coming Friday. So this book, titled Theoretical Times, began, was framed, was started in a blog. So Steve, hello.
Hello.
And welcome back to the vlog by popular demand. Steve, let's start at the beginning, and let's start with you and your website. You ran a static website, a Web 1 website, for about a decade, and then you made a decision to move it to an interactive website, a Web 2 website, via www.steveredhead.zone. So Steve, why did you make that change from Web 1 and Web 2, from a static website to an interactive website, which did include a blog?
Yes, that's certainly true that for a long time I did have a website which didn't have a blog. And I was a reluctant social media figure, really. I realised that you really can't be reluctant anymore. But for a long time I was, and one of the reasons I didn't have the blog was I was sceptical about its effects, actually. And I thought, when I revamped my website, that I would actually have a go. And by that time, I'd also started reading other people's blogs.
Interesting.
So I thought you could develop something, your own style, and as you said in your introduction, that you could control it, which was also an important part of putting ideas out there.
Yeah.
I did want feedback, but I also wanted to be able to control what I was doing and saying. And the idea of a regular blog came about because I'd had this idea of the third book in a theoretical trilogy. And the book is called Theoretical Times. The blog was also called Theoretical Times. And what I started doing was a regular blog. It didn't necessarily have to be every week, but we were moving house and states and universities at the time. And I knew that I wanted to be able to get something out there, ideas based actually on a series of podcasts we did, which was also called Theoretical Times, a dozen podcasts,
yeah,
which helped me then frame the blog. But it was partly to do with this shortage of time. I didn't actually have blocks of time where I could start to write the chapters. And what I wanted to do was almost keep a diary of the ideas that I was developing for this book, Theoretical Times. And in a sense, that's what the Theoretical Times blog is. And if you go to it now, it's still up on my website. So there's actually about 25, 26 blogs, blog posts, which are developed into the book itself, Theoretical Times, which comes out in November.
So that's amazing to me. I didn't know that. So we've been moving through a whole series of different jobs. So analog disruption, if you will. And so you use the blog to create some digital continuity, some note taking while we were moving states, houses, universities.
I did.
And for PhD students, and in fact that's our next question, for PhD students who are incredibly disrupted, the very nature of a PhD is a very disruptive experience. How do you think a blog could be used by PhD and early career researchers? Because obviously you've written 17 books, 7 since the year 2000. But Steve, how could we enable our early career researchers and PhD students? What would they get out of it in the way that perhaps a senior scholar wouldn't?
Well, I think in my experience, the idea of doing it as a diary is actually very useful, and a diary of the research as it's going along. So formulating ideas for the PhD that you're doing in a blog is a really good idea. And also you get the feedback, or often you do get feedback, which helps you move on from the initial diary entries. So I think that's probably a good way of seeing it. I must admit that I probably wouldn't have done it like that if I'd been a PhD student, but I've had to realise, in fact, the effects of, as I say, being a social media figure and how beneficial that is. So I would definitely encourage people to do it in the way that I did it. That's not to say there aren't other ways, but I think for the reasons I've given, there's a real benefit from blogging.
And I think Rachel's been incredibly prescient in this request.
She has.
And very clever. Yes, it has that reflexive component, but that note-taking component, Rach, might be important. So as you have a concept that you think might be bigger than the PhD but important to a book, you could actually capture it in a blog and remember and use it later. I think that's great. But before we get to the book, let's start with, say, refereed articles, if we can. So say a PhD student has published a refereed article, and we always recommend that PhD students do that. Then what is the role of the blog after the refereed article has been published?
Well, I think it's a good way of disseminating, and I think it's a platform that you can use to disseminate the research that you've actually published. But also I think it's worth thinking about kind of reflecting on what you've done. Because once you publish something, that doesn't mean to say it's all over Red Rover. You can actually develop that work maybe into aspects of the PhD, for example. If you're writing a PhD and you're writing articles at the time, it may be that you can feed off that article into a more developed aspect of the PhD. And a blog is a good way of actually transitioning that. But also, I think it's that general idea of reflexivity is really, really important for PhD students. And you're actually controlling that reflexivity. You're not necessarily having to go into your tutor's office and sort of justifying things. You can actually, through sort of flights of ideas, develop the work that's going on in the PhD through that blog.
And I think that's really important. Part of what these vlogs are about, part of what we try and do at Flinders University, is empower PhD students and research master's students. As a PhD student, research master's student, you control so little of your destiny. And a blog is one way to control it. And I was just thinking as you were speaking there, Steve, if you've published a refereed article, then the blog could be the connective tissue between one piece of work and your next piece of work. And so you could disseminate it, write it in a different way. Journalists may pick that up, and that's terrific, but it can also provide the scaffolding to the next piece as you reflect on it. So I think that's a great point. And I did just mention journalists and dissemination and so forth, but I'm a big believer that PhD students, and in fact all academics, should also write journalism and commentary. And, so 1,000 words, 500 words. So how do you think a blog could enable journalism for PhD students?
Well, I think that's something that PhD students should do. I really do. Whatever discipline, by the way. It's going to help you with your communication in whatever job you do, but I think it's well worth thinking about in those terms. And a blog is journalism, it's citizens journalism, and it's an overused term in many ways, but it is. And as we've said, it gives a control to what you do, maybe even a control to how you develop a particular style of writing. And in some ways it's an experiment in public. I think that's what I enjoyed about blogging. And if you do have a reasonable amount of control over it, and where it's going and which platform it's going to go on to and so on, then that's probably a good thing. But it is a form of journalism. So it's practice for other forms of journalism, but it's a form of journalism in itself.
Yeah, and it's also showing your wares. As someone who has written
Yes.
probably 600, 700 articles of journalism through the Times Higher and beyond, the hardest thing when you're starting is to convince an editor that you can do it, that you can actually write pithy, that's your word,
Yeah.
but pithy, exciting, innovative commentary, because you've got to sell your wares. And the great thing about having a blog is you can actually provide a link to an editor to the blog and show them in real time what you can do. And that's a brand new Web 2 experience that when those of us that were writing for 10, 15, 20 years, we didn't have that opportunity to flog it in that way. We had to beg and plead.
Absolutely. And
say
you've taken away the gatekeepers. I think that's an important thing for PhD students to think about. In the past, gatekeepers actually stopped you writing.
Crucial, absolutely crucial. So let's now follow up Rachel's request and get into the book publishing element here. So Steve, you're unusual because you've published so many books in your career and it's split analogue and digital. So it's year 2000, you're about half and half at this point. So that's very different from saying me. I think I've published 17 books, but all after the year 2000. So my entire experience is digital. I can't necessarily comment on the changes. So how do you think that the web and social media has transformed publishing for academics?
I think there's no doubt now that you can see the big changes, and certainly for PhD students, prospective publishing projects, they've got to understand how that world has changed.
Right.
I've said about gatekeepers before, publishers in the past have been gatekeepers, and I think the openness with which publishing is now transforming itself is going to benefit people. No doubt about that. And PhD students have to take advantage of it, in my view.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point because the gatekeeping has reduced in all disciplines, from the hard sciences to the high humanities. Each piece of research has been cut up into different ways, and also the dissemination is different. I mean, it's disintermediation. You're reducing the layers of the gatekeeping. So we can be dealing directly with editors and directly with sub-editors without the multiple layers. I think that's a really good point. Now, the book that you are delivering to publishers this Friday, #NoPressure, is titled Theoretical Times. So to help Rachel and all our students, could we do a little bit of a how-to guide? How did you write the book from the blog? Can you actually give us the how-to guide? How did that happen from these, what was it, 24 or so posts? How did that become a book?
Yes, I mean, it certainly initially started through social media on the podcast that we did. There are 12 Theoretical Times podcasts.
Yeah.
And that was a very early stage of the formulation of how the book was going to be written. I didn't have a publisher then. And as I say, with transitioning from state and from home at university, I didn't actually have the time to sit down and write the chapters. So what I did was I wrote sections of blogs as I was going along, and there are now 25, 26. And when you see the book, you'll see that the style of writing has changed, and even some of the formulations. But essentially, the 25 are the book. And
that's amazing.
I really did deliberately do it in that way. Once I realised I'd got something, and that my feedback on different platforms was really coming in and saying, don't like that, but actually this bit is okay. And I had some really great critical feedback, which I used to then write the chapters in Our Beautiful Home Here in a more leisurely way. I did get a publisher, the wonderful Emerald publisher, my editor Philippa Grand, and all the people at Emerald who designed wonderful covers and all this sort of thing. I mean, once I was into the actual writing of the chapters of the book, I kind of left the blog behind.
Yes.
But the blog itself was the crucial foundation for the book.
And would you say it was conceptual? So
Yes.
in the blogs, did you in a nuggety way, work through the concept until it was resolved?
I did, yes. Although what I found was that once I started writing the chapters based on the blogs, that I had to work even harder, a different style of writing maybe, but also I had probably closed off arguments about the concepts, and the book is about concepts, theoretical times. I had to go away and really develop something much more founded than the actual blog. So that's quite interesting. The blog really, really helped me, and then I realised when I was writing the chapters that I had to do much more. So I would stop and go to my library and actually get material that I hadn't put in the blog. So that's quite an interesting way of... It was experimenting in public, but it was a great experiment. Really helpful.
And that's so useful. I didn't know any of this, by the way, and I live with him. The next question I want to ask, though, is about writing. And you've already touched on the different writing styles. I'm going to push you a little bit more. So what was the concrete difference between writing a small little experiment in public, so writing the blog in terms of style modality, if you will, to then transcribe that into a scholarly monograph? What was the writing difference, if you can? Hard question, I know.
No, there's no doubt that when I started to develop the blog, and you can see it in the 25, 26 that are there, there's an experiment in style. So I had written a lot of journalism in my career, but I'd also written a lot of academic books and academic articles as well. And in some ways, the blog is actually in between.
Huge.
So I was able to keep a more theoretical style, which is what I wanted for the Theoretical Times book, in the blog than I would have if I'd actually just been writing journalism. So I went for high theory in some ways, and raw realism, which is what the book is trying to do, combine high theory and raw realism. I tried both of those things in the blog, and in some ways, in terms of just journalism, I wouldn't have done it in that way. So it's not that the blog was somehow sort of below journalism, it was in between journalism and academic writing, certainly in the way that I consider it.
Which was that old great concept from John Savage, of course, and Simon Frith, our great colleague, the academic journalist, the journalist academic.
Yes, absolutely.
Fascinating. Who knew we'd go there today? Unbelievable. Let's talk about feedback. You've mentioned the word feedback a few times. You linked your blog post to LinkedIn, to Twitter, to Facebook. You handled it really well. And we're in touch with all our colleagues, all our great mates around the world. Hi, guys. And they were offering comment and feedback on those blogs. So tell us about the feedback and its role in building up the book from the blog.
Yes, this was vital.
Wow.
Because as the Theoretical Times blog developed, I could see that I'd really got something, because the feedback, even though it may have been critical, was actually saying, look, you should really go ahead, you've been really brave here, these are tough times, this is actually a very rough and tough blog, and it'll be a rough and tough book. So I got confidence from that.
Huge.
That's not to say I didn't take into account specific comments, but I actually got confidence from the general nature of the feedback, which I suppose told me that I had something that was worth pursuing. Yeah,
I mean, that's great. And did you, in terms of the iterative element of it, were they offering, like, read this, have a look at this theorist?
Yes, specifically.
How does it link with this particular environment?
Yes.
I know Claudia, for example, on Facebook was offering incredibly detailed commentary to you. Hi, Claudia.
And that was such a fantastic way for me to develop the blog, because I hadn't realised the things that people were saying. So Claudia's a great example. She was writing things on Facebook for me, and I was then going back to the chapters as the blog developed and using that material and going in, and that's what I was saying before, that I was going into my library and realising that I hadn't put material in, but it was the comments that made me realise I hadn't put that stuff in.
And that's terrific. It's not the nasty refereeing, it's
No.
Steve, you're being courageous, keep going with this, keep going mate, keep going, which is rare in academic life because it's often a very selfish, nasty space a lot of the time.
Yes.
And there was a lot of intellectual generosity with your colleagues around the world.
Very much so. And people I hadn't had contact with for 20 years, you know, it's great.
Final question, and it's an important one. Now, you and I, I'll just preface this by saying you and I have committed our lives, our career to open access. So those podcasts you talked about, open access, freely available now. Anyone around the world can download them. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people have downloaded the podcasts over the years. Similarly, with our refereed scholarship, it's open access, right? Now, a lot of PhD students, and this does worry me, I'm expressing this as an honest concern, are very interested in controlling their words and putting embargoes on their PhDs and embargoes on this and that and controlling it. So for the final question, I wanted to ask you if there were any challenges or worries you had with regard to privacy or the disadvantage of blogging a book. Were your publishers concerned about that? Were they saying, oh, look, there's 25 posts there, it's a 80,000 word book, are we giving away stuff for free when we should be charging for it? Are there disadvantages we need to be stressing to the students?
No, bog off. Buy one, get one free, is my view. I think the idea of publishing changes is very specific here. I certainly found that approaching Emerald, which I did on another basis to do with this book series that I was reviewing for them, meant that they were very, very specific about it. My editor, Philip Grand, looked at my website as a whole, so the website as a whole is very important. But the Theoretical Times blog, she started reading and really enjoyed bits of that work and wanted to publish the book then. So the absolute opposite is true, that social media was a really, really important new way of getting your work published eventually, because the publishers want to know what sort of audience there is, but also the publishers and reviewers could go to that blog and look at the ideas. They could see that there was something there, and there's no doubt that that happened.
And that's called, by the way, a freemium model, freemium. So giving material away for free, and then if people want the fully fleshed ideas, there is a premium that you pay to read that in a book form. So that's a freemium model, and a very successful model for the last 10 years or so. So Steve, thank you so much, as always, for our conversations. I've learned a lot this morning. I hope you have as well. And Rachel, like Jamie Oliver, here was one I prepared earlier for you. And I thought I'd finish with a really interesting, fascinating statistic that I picked up this week. 81% of the US population reported that they wanted to write a book. 81% of the US population reported that they wanted to write a book in their lifetime. And only 2% ever did. So Rachel, I hope you're in that 2%. As always, I wish you love, light and peace. T and S out. Cheers, team.